The soft hum of elegant conversations filled the air as Dr. Marcus Wright entered Laley, one of Atlanta's most prestigious restaurants. The glow from the chandeliers reflected off the polished marble floors, casting a warm light over the crowded room. The place was buzzing with high-profile guests, lawyers, doctors, and business moguls, engaged in lively discussions over wine and fine dining. Tonight, Marcus was one of those high-profile guests, celebrating a major achievement in his medical career. At 32, Marcus had already made a name for himself as one of the most talented physicians in the city. Just hours earlier, he had delivered a groundbreaking presentation at a medical conference, announcing a major advancement in the treatment of autoimmune diseases. It was a victory, not just for him, but for the entire medical team that had spent years working on the research. As Marcus entered the private dining area, his colleagues greeted him with cheers and applause. "Marcus, that was an incredible presentation today. You really outdid yourself," said Dr. Emily Harris, one of his closest colleagues, raising her glass in a toast. Emily was a petite woman with sharp, intelligent eyes, and she had been by Marcus' side through every step of their research. "Thank you, Emily," Marcus replied, clinking his glass with hers. "It's been a long journey, but we did it together." The table was filled with laughter and animated conversation, everyone riding the high of their recent success. Plates of gourmet food were passed around, and the rich scent of roasted duck and truffle-infused pasta filled the air. Marcus leaned back in his chair, smiling as he watched his colleagues talk excitedly about the future of their research. "I can't believe how far we've come," Marcus said, his voice filled with pride. "This could change everything for patients with autoimmune disorders." "It will," Emily said confidently, "and you deserve every bit of recognition for it." Marcus chuckled, taking a sip of his wine. As much as he appreciated the praise, he was never one to seek out the spotlight. His passion for medicine had always been about helping people, and this breakthrough was just another step toward that goal. Still, there was no denying the satisfaction of knowing that their work could improve and possibly save countless lives. As the conversation at the table continued, Marcus's phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out to see a text from his older brother, Thomas Wright. "Thomas, proud of you, little bro. Can't wait to hear all about it." Marcus smiled. His brother had always been his biggest supporter. Thomas Wright was a well-known civil rights lawyer, famous for his high-profile cases challenging police brutality and racial injustice. Their bond was strong, forged by their shared determination to make a difference in the world, albeit through different fields. Before Marcus could reply to the message, the mood at the restaurant shifted. The clatter of dishes and soft chatter died down as two uniformed police officers entered the room. Their stern expressions and the way their eyes scanned the tables made it clear that they weren't here for dinner. Marcus noticed the tension immediately. The officers stood out in the sea of well-dressed patrons, their presence an unsettling contrast to the elegant surroundings. They exchanged brief words with the restaurant manager, who pointed in Marcus' direction. Without another word, the officers began making their way toward his table. "Excuse me, sir," one of the officers said brusquely as they reached Marcus. "We need to see your identification." Marcus blinked, momentarily taken aback. "Is there a problem, officer?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady despite the sudden scrutiny. "We're just doing our job, sir," the officer replied, his tone sharp. "Please present your ID." A ripple of confusion and discomfort spread through the table. Marcus's colleagues, who had been so full of joy and laughter moments ago, now fell silent. Dr. Harris, sitting beside him, shot the officers a concerned look. "What's going on here?" she asked, her voice firm but polite. "Why do you need to see his ID?" The officers ignored her, their focus solely on Marcus. One of them placed his hand on the holster of his gun, a subtle but unmistakable threat. Marcus could feel his heart pounding in his chest. He knew he hadn't done anything wrong, but that didn't matter. He had seen this kind of situation unfold too many times before. Black men being targeted, questioned, humiliated, all because they were in the wrong place in the eyes of the police. This restaurant, with its high-end clientele and luxurious ambiance, was apparently such a place tonight. Slowly, Marcus reached into his pocket and pulled out his wallet. He handed over his ID, trying to suppress the frustration bubbling inside him. As the officer examined it, Marcus could feel the eyes of the entire restaurant on him. The sense of violation was palpable, the humiliation stinging like a slap to the face. "Dr. Marcus Wright, huh?" The officer's voice dripped with sarcasm as he read the name off the ID. "And you think that gives you the right to be here?" Marcus clenched his jaw. He wanted to respond, to say something, anything, that would cut through the blatant racism in the officer's words. But he held his tongue. Years of experience had taught him that pushing back in moments like this only made things worse. Before he could respond, Dr. Harris stood up. "This is absurd," she said, her voice rising with anger. "He's a respected doctor and a customer here. You can't just—" "We can do whatever we need to," the second officer interrupted, cutting her off. "Stay out of this, ma'am. We're handling it." The officer's dismissive tone only fueled the growing tension at the table. Marcus's colleagues exchanged uneasy glances, unsure of what to do. The restaurant manager, clearly uncomfortable with the scene unfolding in his establishment, approached the officers cautiously. "Officers, Dr. Wright is a regular customer here," the manager said, his voice trying to remain diplomatic. "There must be some misunderstanding." "We'll decide what's a misunderstanding," the first officer snapped. "Now back off." Marcus could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him. He had done nothing wrong. Yet here he was, being treated like a criminal simply for existing in a space these officers thought he didn't belong. It was infuriating, humiliating, but most of all, familiar. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the officers returned his ID with a sarcastic smirk. "You're free to go, this time," one of them said, his tone making it clear that Marcus had been lucky to escape further harassment. Without another word, the officers turned and walked away, leaving a stunned silence in their wake. Marcus sat there, his fists clenched under the table, trying to process what had just happened. His night of celebration had been shattered, and in its place was the cold, hard reality of being a black man in America. No matter how successful, no matter how educated, no matter how respected, he was still seen as a threat. Dr. Harris placed a hand on his shoulder. "I'm so sorry, Marcus," she whispered, her voice filled with sympathy. Marcus shook his head, his face a mask of calm, but inside he was seething. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. Marcus left the restaurant earlier than planned that night, his mood somber as he stepped out into the cool evening air. The celebration that had started with so much promise was now a distant memory, replaced by the heavy weight of humiliation. As he walked toward his car, the echoes of the police officer's words replayed in his mind. No matter how many years of success he had under his belt, no matter how prestigious his title, in moments like that, it felt like none of it mattered. The streets of Atlanta were busy, but the usual hustle and bustle of the city seemed muted to Marcus. He pulled out his phone and saw another message from his brother, Thomas, waiting for him. "Thomas, how's the celebration going? Everything good?" Marcus hesitated before responding, his fingers hovering over the screen. His initial instinct was to brush it off, to tell his brother everything was fine. After all, Thomas was always dealing with more than enough of his own, fighting battles against systemic racism in the courts. But Marcus couldn't shake the anger that had been simmering inside him since the incident at the restaurant. He needed to tell someone. He needed Thomas to know. He tapped out a quick reply. "Marcus, it was going fine, until 2 cops showed up at the restaurant and harassed me in front of everyone." The reply came almost instantly. "Thomas, what? What happened?" Marcus took a deep breath before launching into the details, recounting every humiliating moment, the way the officers had singled him out, the sarcastic tone in their voices, the way they'd questioned his right to even be there. By the time he hit send, he was seething all over again. Within seconds, his phone rang. It was Thomas. "Marcus," Thomas said, his voice tight with controlled anger. "Are you okay?" "I'm fine," Marcus replied, though he didn't feel fine. It's infuriating, you know? No matter what we achieve, it's like we're still viewed as less than." Thomas was silent for a moment, and when he spoke again, his voice was steady but fierce. "I'm not letting them get away with this. Did you get the officers' names or badge numbers?" "No," Marcus said, leaning against his car. I was too busy trying to keep my cool and not escalate the situation. Thomas sighed, but his determination was clear. Doesn't matter. I'll find out who they were. This is exactly the kind of thing we've been fighting against. You're not alone in this, Marcus. I'll make sure those cops answer for what they did. Marcus appreciated his brother's passion, but he knew the reality of these situations all too well. Accountability was hard to come by, especially when it came to police misconduct. I don't know, man, Marcus said. You know how these things go. They'll say they were just doing their job, and nothing will come of it. Not if I have anything to say about it, Thomas replied, his voice firm. This is personal, Marcus. They humiliated you, but they also insulted everything we stand for. I'm going to make sure they regret it. As much as Marcus wanted to believe his brother, part of him felt weary. He had spent his entire life navigating moments like these, small humiliations, subtle slights, and the constant reminder that his skin color always made him a suspect in the eyes of some. But Thomas, with his tireless energy and his unwavering belief in justice, never seemed to tire of the fight. I appreciate you, Thomas, Marcus said quietly. I really do. You're my brother, Thomas replied. We're in this together, always. After hanging up, Marcus stood there for a few moments, letting the conversation sink in. The streetlights flickered overhead, casting long shadows on the pavement. He couldn't shake the frustration that gnawed at him, but knowing that Thomas was ready to take action gave him a sense of solace. Maybe this time, things would be different. Maybe this time, someone would actually be held accountable. Later that night, Marcus found himself pacing the living room of his apartment. The elegant furniture and modern decor did little to soothe his restless mind. His thoughts kept drifting back to the looks on the officers' faces, those smug, dismissive expressions that said they knew they could get away with anything. It wasn't the first time Marcus had experienced something like this, but every time it felt like a fresh wound. The door to the apartment opened, and Thomas walked in, still dressed in his suit from court. He was always impeccably put together, his tall frame and commanding presence making him an imposing figure both in and out of the courtroom. But tonight, Thomas's face was set in a grim expression, his usual calm demeanor replaced by something more intense. "Any word yet?" Marcus asked, hoping his brother had some update. Thomas shook his head, tossing his briefcase onto the couch. "I'm working on it. I've got a few contacts in the department, and I'm going to get the names of those officers. They're not walking away from this unscathed." Marcus slumped into one of the chairs, rubbing his temples. "I just don't get it. I was sitting there, minding my own business, and they came straight to me. Not to any of the other diners, just me. They saw a black man in a high-end restaurant," Thomas said bluntly. "That's all it took." Marcus nodded, though the truth of it still stung. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "How do you keep doing this, Thomas? How do you keep fighting when it feels like nothing ever changes?" Thomas sat down across from him, his gaze steady. "Because it does change. Slowly, painfully, but it does. Every case I've fought, every victory I've won, it's a step forward. And every time we stand up to them, we make it harder for them to get away with this kind of crap." Marcus knew his brother was right. Thomas had spent his entire career taking on cases that challenged police brutality and racial injustice. He had seen the system from the inside, and he had dedicated his life to dismantling the corruption that plagued it. But knowing that didn't make it any easier to stomach. "I just wish it didn't have to be us, every time," Marcus muttered. "I'm tired of always having to prove that I belong." "We all are," Thomas replied, his voice softer now. "But that's why we fight. So the next generation won't have to prove it. So one day they can just exist without having to justify themselves to anyone." The brothers sat in silence for a few moments, the weight of the conversation settling between them. Marcus appreciated Thomas's words, but the exhaustion of fighting a battle that seemed never-ending hung heavy on him. Still, there was a flicker of hope, a small part of him that believed things might be different this time, if only because Thomas was involved. "Tomorrow, I'll have more information," Thomas said, standing up, "and we're going to make sure those cops pay for what they did. Not just for you, but for every black man they've treated like this." Marcus looked up at his brother, feeling a surge of gratitude. "Thanks, man. Thomas gave a small nod. Always. As Thomas left the apartment, Marcus sat back in the chair, staring out at the city skyline. The anger still simmered beneath the surface, but for the first time that night he felt a sense of calm. He wasn't alone in this. His brother had his back, and together they were going to fight back. The next morning, Marcus woke up with a renewed sense of purpose, though the bitter taste of the previous night's events still lingered. He glanced at his phone, hoping to see a message from Thomas, but there was nothing yet. It didn't surprise him. His brother had likely been working through the night to gather information on the officers who had harassed him. Thomas never stopped when it came to fighting for justice. Marcus decided to get an early start. He showered, dressed, and headed to the hospital where he worked. As he walked into the bright, sterile halls, the usual sense of accomplishment he felt was dampened by the weight of the incident at the restaurant. It was hard to feel proud of his achievements when he was constantly reminded that, to some, none of it mattered. Dr. Emily Harris was already in the office when he arrived, a cup of coffee in her hand and a determined look on her face. She stood up as soon as she saw Marcus enter, her expression softening with concern. "Hey," she said, her voice gentle. "How are you holding up?" "I'm fine," Marcus replied, though the weariness in his voice betrayed him. Emily gave him a knowing look. "You don't have to pretend with me, Marcus. What happened last night was awful. If it were me, I'd be furious." "I am," he admitted, leaning against his desk. "But I'm trying not to let it consume me. I can't afford to be distracted, not with everything we've got going on." Emily nodded, though her face remained clouded with concern. "Still, I don't think you should just let this slide. Those cops need to be held accountable." "They will be," Marcus said, with more certainty than he felt. "Thomas is already working on it. He's going to make sure they answer for what they did." "Good," Emily replied, her voice filled with quiet resolve. "Because they don't get to treat you like that. Not after everything you've accomplished." Marcus gave a small, appreciative smile. Emily had always been one of his closest allies, both professionally and personally. They had spent years working together, pushing boundaries in their field, and she had been there through every challenge, every triumph. "I'm lucky to have you on my team," Marcus said, his voice sincere. Emily smiled back, but before she could respond, there was a knock on the door. A nurse poked her head in, looking slightly nervous. "Dr. Wright," the nurse said, "there's someone here to see you. He's waiting in the lobby." Marcus frowned. He wasn't expecting anyone. "Who is it?" The nurse hesitated. "It's a police officer, sir." Marcus felt his stomach tighten. The memory of the night before came rushing back, and for a brief moment his mind raced with possibilities. Had something else happened? Was this another unwelcome confrontation? "Did he say what he wants?" Marcus asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "No, just that he needed to speak with you," the nurse replied. Emily shot Marcus a concerned look, but Marcus nodded at her, silently assuring her he'd be fine. "I'll be right back," he said, heading out of the office and down the hall toward the lobby. As he approached the lobby, Marcus spotted the officer standing near the front desk. This one was different from the men who had harassed him last night. He was older, with a more weathered face and a calm demeanor. His uniform was neatly pressed, and his posture was relaxed, almost disarmingly so. "Dr. Wright?" the officer asked as Marcus approached. "That's me," Marcus replied, crossing his arms over his chest. "Can I help you?" The officer gave a small nod. "I'm Officer Davis. I understand there was an incident last night involving 2 of our officers, and I wanted to come by personally to speak with you about it." Marcus raised an eyebrow, suspicion creeping into his mind. "And why is that?" "Because I believe it's important to get your side of the story," Davis said, his voice even. "I heard what happened and, well, let's just say I don't think it was handled properly." The admission caught Marcus off guard. He had expected the usual dismissiveness, the same tired excuses about protocol and procedures. Instead, Davis seemed genuinely interested in hearing what Marcus had to say. "Look, I know how this usually goes," Marcus said, his tone guarded, "but I'm not interested in giving my side of the story just so it can be swept under the rug. I've seen how these things play out." Davis held up his hands, palms out in a gesture of peace. "I understand your hesitation, Dr. Wright. I really do. But I can assure you, I'm not here to make excuses for what happened. I'm here because there are people within the department who care about doing the right thing, and we need to know when our officers cross the line. Marcus studied Davis for a moment, trying to gauge whether the man was sincere or just playing a part. There was something about the way Davis spoke that felt different, though, less rehearsed, more genuine. Still, Marcus wasn't ready to let his guard down just yet. "All right," Marcus said cautiously. "What exactly do you want from me?" "I just want to know what happened," Davis replied. "From your perspective. I've already heard the official report, but I'd like to hear it from you. Off the record, if you prefer." Marcus hesitated. He wasn't sure how much he wanted to divulge, especially without his brother present. But something about the way Officer Davis stood there, with no pressure, no aggression, made Marcus feel like maybe, just maybe, this time could be different. "I was having dinner with colleagues at Lely," Marcus began, his voice steady. "Two officers came in and demanded my ID. I wasn't causing any trouble, wasn't being disruptive. They singled me out, made some questionable remarks, and after checking my ID, they walked away." Davis listened intently, nodding along as Marcus spoke. When Marcus finished, the officer sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "I'm sorry that happened to you, Dr. Wright. I know that doesn't change what you experienced, but I want you to know there are people in the department who are trying to fix this, who don't believe in treating people the way you were treated." Marcus appreciated the sentiment, but he remained cautious. Words were one thing, actions were another. "I hope that's true," Marcus replied, "because this isn't just about me. This is about the way black men are treated, no matter how successful we are. No matter what we've accomplished, we're always seen as suspects." Davis nodded again, his expression serious. "I understand, and I'll be reporting this incident to Internal Affairs. I'm not sure what will come of it, but I want you to know that your voice is being heard." For the first time since the incident, Marcus felt a flicker of hope. He had been bracing for another dismissal, another brush-off, but Davis seemed genuine in his intent to address what had happened. Still, Marcus knew that real change wouldn't come from a single conversation. It would take more than one well-meaning officer to shift the tides of a broken system. "I appreciate you coming by," Marcus said finally, "but I'll believe it when I see it." Davis offered a small smile, as if he understood exactly where Marcus was coming from. "Fair enough. If you ever want to follow up, here's my card." He handed Marcus a business card, then gave a polite nod before heading for the door. "Take care, Dr. Wright." Marcus watched him leave, feeling a mixture of relief and skepticism. It was hard to trust the system when it had failed so many people like him, time and time again. But maybe, just maybe, there were people like Davis who could make a difference from the inside. As Marcus headed back to his office, he couldn't help but wonder what Thomas would think of the visit. His brother had always been a fighter, someone who believed in taking the system head-on. Maybe that's what Marcus needed to do too. Maybe it was time to stop just trying to survive these encounters and start fighting back. That afternoon, Marcus found himself sitting in his office, staring at the card Officer Davis had given him. The conversation had left him conflicted. Part of him wanted to believe there were good cops like Davis who wanted to make a difference, but the realist in him knew better. One kind officer didn't change the system. It didn't erase what had happened. As Marcus mulled over his thoughts, his phone rang. He glanced at the screen and saw Thomas's name flash across it. He answered immediately. "Hey, Thomas, got any updates?" Marcus asked, leaning back in his chair. "I do," Thomas replied, his voice sounding tight with barely contained anger. "I pulled some strings and found out who those officers were. Officer Gregson and Officer Reese. Both of them have complaints against them for racial profiling, but of course, nothing's ever stuck." Marcus's stomach turned. He wasn't surprised, but hearing it confirmed made his anger flare up all over again. "And nothing's been done about it?" "Not a thing," Thomas replied, the frustration clear in his voice. "But it gets worse. These two officers have been involved in a handful of incidents, like the one you experienced. Minorities being harassed in upscale neighborhoods, restaurants, and shops. There's a pattern, Marcus, and it's obvious they've been getting away with this for years. Marcus sighed, his jaw clenching as he tried to contain the rage boiling inside him. So what now? What can we do? Well, Thomas began, first things first. We're going to file a formal complaint. I've already started drafting it. We're going to make sure your case doesn't get brushed under the rug like all the others. And then, Marcus asked, his voice edged with impatience. And then we go public. Thomas said firmly, we get the media involved, civil rights groups, everyone we can. We apply enough pressure that the department can't ignore it. These guys have been hiding behind the badge for too long. It's time to expose them. Marcus nodded, feeling a sense of determination building inside him. All right, let's do it. Good. I'm meeting with some of my contacts later today. We'll need your statement, of course, and we'll need to be prepared for pushback. The department won't go down without a fight. Marcus was more than ready for it. Whatever it takes, I'm done letting this kind of thing slide. As he hung up the phone, Marcus felt a surge of energy. This wasn't just about what had happened to him. It was about standing up for everyone who had been targeted, harassed, or humiliated by officers like Gregson and Reese. He wasn't going to be a silent victim. A knock on the door pulled Marcus from his thoughts. Emily stepped inside, her face filled with concern. I heard from one of the nurses that you had a police officer visit you earlier. Everything okay? Marcus nodded, though his expression was still tense. Yeah, it was just an officer from Internal Affairs. He said he wanted to hear my side of the story. Emily raised an eyebrow. And you believe him? I don't know, Marcus admitted. He seemed genuine, but I'm not putting all my faith in it. My brother's already digging up dirt on the officers who harassed me. We're filing a formal complaint and going public. Emily's eyes widened in surprise and admiration. Good for you, Marcus. This needs to be out in the open. People need to know what's happening. They will, Marcus said, his voice firm. I'm not letting this go. Emily gave a small smile, though her concern still lingered. If you need anything at all, you know I'm here. Thanks, Emily, Marcus replied, grateful for her support. I appreciate it. Emily lingered for a moment, as if she wanted to say more, but she simply nodded and left the room, leaving Marcus alone with his thoughts once again. Later that evening, Marcus met Thomas at a downtown cafe. It was a quiet spot, perfect for the type of conversation they needed to have. When Marcus arrived, Thomas was already seated, a stack of papers spread out in front of him. He looked up as Marcus approached, his expression serious but resolute. I've been busy, Thomas said, gesturing to the papers. These are reports from the other complaints filed against Gregson and Reese. None of them went anywhere, but the details are pretty damning. It's clear these two have a habit of targeting people of color in affluent areas. They've been getting away with it for too long. Marcus sat down, picking up one of the reports and skimming through it. The stories were all too familiar. Black men being pulled over for no reason, questioned while shopping in high-end stores, or harassed in upscale restaurants. Just like him. And just like all the others, the complaints had been filed, investigated, and ultimately dismissed. They always find a way to justify it, Thomas said, his voice laced with disgust, claiming they were just doing their job, or that the person in question was acting suspiciously. It's the same old story every time. Marcus shook his head, anger surging through him again. And they get away with it because no one challenges them. No one holds them accountable. Exactly, Thomas said, leaning forward. But this time is different. We have your story, and we're going to make sure it's heard. I've already reached out to a journalist friend of mine. She's interested in covering it. We just need to be prepared for the backlash. Marcus nodded, understanding the weight of what they were about to do. Going public with this would put him in the spotlight. And it wouldn't be easy. The police department wouldn't take kindly to being called out, and there would be plenty of people who would defend the officers, no matter how damning the evidence. Are you sure about this, Marcus? Thomas asked, his voice softening. Once we go down this road, there's no turning back. You'll be putting yourself in the middle of a very public fight. I'm sure, Marcus replied, his voice unwavering. I've spent my entire life working twice as hard to prove that I belong. I'm tired of it. I'm tired of people like them thinking they can treat us however they want just because of the color of our skin. If going public is what it takes to stop them, then I'm ready. Thomas smiled, pride evident in his expression. That's the Marcus I know. They spent the next hour going over the details, what to say, how to frame the narrative, and how to make sure they had the support of the community behind them. Thomas had done this before, countless times, but for Marcus, it was uncharted territory. Still, he felt confident with his brother guiding him. They were in this together. As they finished their coffee and gathered their things, Thomas looked at Marcus with a serious expression. I've got your back, no matter what happens. We're going to see this through. Marcus nodded, feeling the full weight of his brother's words. I know, and I'm ready. They left the cafe, stepping out into the night. The city buzzed around them, its lights casting a glow over the streets. For the first time in days, Marcus felt like he was back in control. He wasn't just reacting to what had happened to him, he was taking action. And no matter how hard the road ahead would be, Marcus was prepared to face it head on. The courtroom was packed, the air thick with anticipation. Journalists lined the back of the room, their cameras ready to capture every moment, while activists and community leaders filled the gallery, their faces etched with a mixture of hope and determination. Outside, protesters gathered, chanting slogans for justice and accountability. Marcus stood at the front, his hands clasped tightly in front of him as he prepared to testify. He had been waiting for this moment for weeks, and now that it was here, he felt a mixture of nerves and resolve. Thomas stood beside him, his face calm and focused, ready to cross-examine the officers who had harassed his brother. This was a moment they had prepared for meticulously. Every piece of evidence had been reviewed, every statement rehearsed. The stakes were high, and they both knew it. What happened in this room today could set a precedent, not just for Marcus, but for all the other victims of police harassment who had been silenced or ignored. All rise, the bailiff called, and everyone in the room stood as the judge entered, a woman with sharp eyes and a reputation for fairness. She took her seat, and the room settled into a tense quiet. Marcus glanced toward the back of the courtroom where the two officers, Gregson and Reese, sat with their attorney. Both men looked calm, confident even, as if they still believed they could get away with what they'd done. That thought fueled Marcus's determination. He would not let them walk away unscathed. The judge cleared her throat. We're here today to address the allegations of misconduct brought forth by Dr. Marcus Wright against officers Gregson and Reese. We will hear testimony from Dr. Wright, followed by cross-examination from the defense. Thomas stepped forward, his voice strong and clear. Your Honor, I would like to begin by calling Dr. Marcus Wright to the stand. Marcus felt a surge of adrenaline as he walked toward the witness stand. The courtroom seemed to grow quieter, all eyes on him as he took his seat and was sworn in. He glanced at Thomas, who gave him a small nod of encouragement before turning to the judge. Dr. Wright, Thomas began, his tone professional but warm, could you please describe the events that took place on the night of your celebration at Laley? Marcus took a deep breath before speaking, his voice steady. I was at Laley, an upscale restaurant in Atlanta, celebrating a major career milestone with my colleagues. We were enjoying our evening when two officers Gregson and Reese, entered the restaurant. They walked directly to our table and demanded to see my ID. Thomas nodded. And to be clear, were you causing any disturbance at the time? No, Marcus replied firmly. We were seated, having dinner, just like every other guest in that restaurant. Did the officers provide any explanation for why they singled you out? Marcus shook his head. No. They just demanded my ID and made it clear that they didn't believe I had any right to be there. They made several comments implying that I didn't belong in a place like Laley. Thomas allowed a brief pause, letting Marcus's words sink in with the judge and the audience. He then continued, How did this interaction make you feel, Dr. Wright? Marcus took a moment before answering, his voice filled with emotion. It was humiliating. I've worked hard my entire life to get to where I am, but in that moment, none of it mattered. To them, I was just a black man in a place they didn't think I belonged. No amount of education, success, or respect could change the fact that in their eyes, I was a suspect. The room was silent, the weight of Marcus's words hanging in the air. Thomas continued his questioning, guiding Marcus through every detail of the night, ensuring that the full picture of the harassment and humiliation was laid out for the court to see. As Marcus recounted the way the officers had belittled him, how they had smirked as they returned his ID, the tension in the room grew palpable. When Thomas had finished, the defense attorney stood up, ready to cross-examine. Marcus braced himself, knowing that this was the part where they would try to twist his words to make it seem like the officers had done nothing wrong. "Dr. Wright," the defense attorney began, his tone sharp, "you've stated that the officers asked for your identification, is that correct?" "Yes," Marcus replied. "And you provided it to them without issue, correct?" "Yes." "So they did not physically harm you, nor did they arrest you. Isn't that right?" Marcus frowned, his frustration rising. "No, they didn't arrest me, but that doesn't mean they didn't harm me." The attorney raised an eyebrow, feigning confusion. "But you just said they didn't harm you physically. How, then, were you harmed?" Marcus met the attorney's gaze, refusing to be intimidated. "There are many ways to harm someone without laying a hand on them. The way they treated me, the things they said, it was meant to humiliate me, to make me feel like I didn't belong, and that's exactly what it did." The defense attorney smirked, clearly attempting to dismiss Marcus's words. "So, you're saying that the officers simply did their job by asking for your ID, but you were offended by the way they did it?" "They didn't simply do their job," Marcus shot back. "They targeted me because of the color of my skin. They made it clear through their words and actions that they didn't believe I belonged in that restaurant." The attorney pressed on, trying to undermine Marcus's testimony, but Marcus stood his ground. He refused to be rattled, no matter how much the defense attorney tried to twist his words. Finally, after what felt like hours, the defense attorney sat down, clearly frustrated that Marcus hadn't given them any ground to work with. The judge called for a brief recess, and Marcus stepped down from the stand, his heart pounding. As he returned to his seat, Thomas clapped him on the shoulder. "You did great," Thomas said quietly. "They didn't shake you." Marcus nodded, though the intensity of the experience still buzzed in his chest. "I just hope it's enough." "It will be," Thomas assured him. "We've got the evidence, and your testimony was rock solid. Now we just need to see how the judge rules." The courtroom buzzed with quiet conversations as people stretched and gathered their thoughts during the recess. Outside, the chants of the protesters could still be heard faintly through the thick walls, their voices calling for justice. Marcus felt a sense of pride knowing that the community was behind him, that this fight wasn't just his own. When the judge returned, the room quickly settled. It was time to hear from the officers themselves. Marcus watched closely as Gregson took the stand, his posture relaxed and confident, as if he believed none of this would stick. His lawyer began questioning him, and predictably, Gregson claimed that everything he had done that night was by the book. "We were responding to a call about a disturbance in the area," Gregson said, his voice smooth. "When we arrived, we saw Dr. Wright, and he fit the description of someone we had been told was acting suspiciously." Marcus felt his anger rise again. It was the same excuse they always used, acting suspiciously. It was vague enough to justify anything, and it was a tactic Marcus knew all too well. Thomas stood and began his cross-examination, his tone cutting and direct. "Officer Gregson, can you provide any documentation of this supposed call you were responding to?" Gregson faltered for a moment, clearly caught off guard. "I don't have it on me, but I'm sure it exists in the department records." Thomas stepped closer to the stand, his eyes locked on Gregson. "So, you can't provide any proof that there was ever a disturbance in the area. Is that correct?" Gregson shifted in his seat, his confidence waning. "Well, I'm sure the department has it on file." Thomas let the silence stretch for a moment before continuing. "You mentioned that Dr. Wright fit the description of the person causing the disturbance. Can you describe what this person looked like?" Gregson hesitated. "We were told it was a black male." "And that's it?" Thomas pressed. "No other identifying details? Just that he was black?" Gregson glanced nervously at his lawyer before answering. "That's what we were told." "So, based solely on the fact that Dr. Wright is a black man, You decided to approach him, demand his identification, and humiliate him in front of his colleagues. Is that correct? Gregson opened his mouth to respond, but Thomas didn't give him the chance. No further questions, Your Honor? As Thomas returned to his seat, Marcus felt a sense of satisfaction. Gregson had been exposed, his excuses unraveling under the weight of the truth. Now it was up to the judge to decide. The courtroom was electric with tension. After Officer Gregson's testimony had fallen apart under Thomas's sharp questioning, the atmosphere had shifted. The confidence Gregson and Reese had initially exuded was gone, replaced by unease. The defense attorney attempted to salvage the case, but the cracks were too deep, the evidence too damning. Marcus sat in the front row next to Thomas, his hands clasped together, his fingers twitching with anticipation. He knew they had presented a strong case. They had exposed the racist actions of the officers for what they were. Now, all they could do was wait. The judge, seated behind her elevated bench, shuffled through her notes and documents, her face unreadable. The silence in the room was heavy, filled with the weight of expectations. Finally, she cleared her throat and looked up, her expression serious. After reviewing the testimony and the evidence provided in this case, it is clear that Officers Gregson and Reese acted in a manner that was not only unprofessional, but also discriminatory, the judge began, her voice firm and authoritative. The harassment that Dr. Marcus Wright endured was unacceptable, and it is the responsibility of this court to ensure that law enforcement is held accountable for such actions. Marcus's heart raced as he listened to her words. This was it, the moment they had fought so hard for. Therefore, the judge continued, I am recommending that the officers involved in this case be placed under further investigation by Internal Affairs, with the strong suggestion that disciplinary action be taken. Additionally, I am ordering that the police department issue a formal apology to Dr. Wright for the treatment he received. The room erupted in whispers and murmurs. It wasn't the full victory Marcus had hoped for, but it was a significant step in the right direction. The officers wouldn't walk away unscathed. They were finally being held accountable, at least in part. Marcus felt a wave of relief wash over him. He glanced at Thomas, who gave him a small nod of approval. It wasn't over, not by a long shot, but they had won a crucial battle. As the judge dismissed the court, Marcus stood, feeling the tension in his body begin to release. He was exhausted, emotionally drained by the weight of the trial, but he also felt a deep sense of accomplishment. He had stood up to the system, and for once, the system had listened. Outside the courthouse, the scene was one of celebration. Protesters who had gathered to support Marcus cheered as he and Thomas stepped out of the building. The media swarmed, microphones and cameras shoved in their faces, eager to capture the moment. Dr. Wright, how do you feel about the judge's ruling? A reporter asked, pushing a microphone toward Marcus. Marcus paused, choosing his words carefully. I'm relieved that the court recognized what happened to me as wrong, he said, his voice steady but tired. But this isn't just about me. This is about the countless black men and women who face this kind of harassment every day. It's about changing the system so that no one else has to go through what I did. His words were met with applause and cheers from the crowd. Marcus could see signs held high, reading, Justice for Marcus and End Racial Profiling. It was a powerful sight, and for the first time since the incident at the restaurant, Marcus felt like real change might be possible. Thomas stepped up beside Marcus and addressed the reporters as well. We are grateful for the judge's ruling, but this is just the beginning. We're going to keep pushing for accountability and reform. The system is broken, and it's going to take all of us, lawyers, activists, and everyday people, to fix it. As they continued to speak with the media, Marcus noticed a familiar face in the crowd, Officer Davis, the one who had visited him at the hospital. He stood on the outskirts, watching the proceedings with a thoughtful expression. Their eyes met, and Davis gave Marcus a small nod before turning to leave. For a moment, Marcus considered going after him, but he decided against it. There would be time for that conversation later. Right now, there were more important things to focus on. Later that evening, Marcus and Thomas found themselves back at Marcus's apartment, decompressing after the long day. The celebration outside the courthouse had been invigorating, but now that they were home, the exhaustion was catching up to them. "You did good today," Thomas said, handing Marcus a beer as they sat down on the couch. "The judge's ruling might not have been perfect, but we made a statement. People are paying attention." Marcus nodded, taking a sip of his drink. "Yeah, I just wish it didn't have to be like this, you know? I wish I didn't have to fight so hard just to be treated with basic respect." "I know," Thomas replied, his voice soft with understanding. "But that's why we keep fighting, so that one day, maybe our kids won't have to." The two brothers sat in comfortable silence for a while, the weight of the day still hanging over them. Marcus thought back to all the other men and women who had been in his position, the ones who hadn't had a brother like Thomas to fight for them, the ones whose voices had been silenced. He thought about how lucky he was to have the support he did, and how many others weren't so fortunate. "I'm thinking about starting something," Marcus said suddenly, breaking the silence. Thomas looked at him curiously. "What do you mean?" "I mean, I don't want this to end with just me," Marcus explained. "There are too many people who go through what I did and don't have the resources to fight back. I want to start a nonprofit, something that helps people who've been victims of police harassment and racial profiling, legal assistance, advocacy, whatever they need." Thomas smiled, his eyes lighting up with pride. "That's a great idea, Marcus. You'd be helping so many people." Marcus nodded, feeling a sense of purpose settle over him. "Yeah, I think it's time to turn all of this into something bigger, something that can make a real, lasting difference." "And you know I'll be right there with you," Thomas said, clinking his beer bottle against Marcus's. "Whatever you need, I'm in." Marcus smiled, feeling a warmth in his chest. It was far from over. There was still so much work to be done, but for the first time in a long time, he felt hopeful about the future. He had faced down the system, and while the battle wasn't fully won, he had taken the first steps toward real change. Together with Thomas, Marcus knew they would continue to fight. For justice, for equality, for a world where people like him didn't have to constantly prove their worth. And as they sat there in the quiet of Marcus' apartment, the weight of the day slowly lifting, Marcus felt ready for whatever came next. Because this was only the beginning.